Recording in progress.
Okay.
Are there any?
Sorry.
No, thanks. Are there any members of the public for public comment? Okay, hearing and seeing none, just looks like fellow commissioners on the call. Then we will move over to the minutes. And I was absent from this, so I will review for my own awareness, but if there's any edits, I'm sure Matt can pass them along to him.
Will do.
The only comment or question I had actually is for Reed in section 5.6. That spelling for Ibiza Mehanak seems different than what I recall in the past. Is that the way it's been spelled?
I can check it. If it gets spelled wrong, I think we'll be okay. Find it here.
See if I can get it up.
It should be Abezimi. No, that's not right. Abezi.
Yeah, it is weird. It's
Meni.
I just saw it in one of our town plan drafts last night, and it was different from this, but I couldn't tell you exactly how. We can.
We'll figure it out. I can't Google it this early in the morning. I'm looking at my email and I'm like, that's also wrong.
English doesn't exactly do justice to the native languages of North America.
Yeah.
Any other comments on the minutes?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes as written, except for a check on the spelling of the name for Tree Island.
I'll second
Second.
that motion.
right, thank you, Laura. I heard Eric and Reed both tied for second.
Eric gets it. He has lag.
It's my
over the
first time I've been able to second a motion in 2 years.
All
You had to
right.
give that one to me.
Can't take that away from me.
Exciting, yeah. Eric gets the prize. Okay, so then we'll take a vote approving the minutes, all approved.
I,
Any objections? Hearing none, and I'm abstaining. Motion carries. And it's approved. As always, Andrew is doing a great job with these minutes. Very thorough. Okay. Get back to the agenda. Okay, item number 4 on the agenda is vacancy on the Conservation Commission and Catamount Community Forest. As we know, we lost a member in the last month, and so actually she was on the she was in several news articles. Terry she was in the Digger, and then she was in the Reporter for her work at Catamount Community Forest. So that was nice to see. But with that vacancy, I believe that we have a discussion here. Matt, are you sure? I'm not quite sure how Andrew was putting this on the agenda.
So the first part is just what you said, which is, we have someone who stepped down from both committees, the WCC by the charge to the Catamount Community Forest Committee, and the way it's organized has a representative that attends those meetings and serves on that committee. And it would be nice if there's interest to go ahead and get someone nominated from WCC to jump back into the Community Forest Committee today, if there's interest, or as soon as we can. So,
Okay.
and we can talk a little bit about what that entails. It's another monthly meeting. And I think most folks are familiar with what the committee does, but I can answer any questions folks have about that. And otherwise, it's just the mechanics of appointing a member to serve over there.
I nominate Kim Coleman.
I'll second that.
Gary. Yeah, Gary's not here. So I as much as we all can appreciate that, unless has he informed you that he actually would like to serve, Laura?
No, I have not heard that,
Okay. All right.
but I wanted to definitely nominate Kim.
Thanks, I appreciate that. Does anybody know if Gary's interested? Like, I'm super happy for if somebody else is interested in this to do this. My like my perspective is that whoever it is should be like in a super collaborative headspace. And that's basically my only opinion.
Matt, how many times per month, per quarter does the Catamount Community Forest Committee meet?
So this is once a month.
Okay. All right, so that would be, so for the WCC commitment, then it's 2 meetings for us and then 1 meeting for the Catamount. What time does
And
that?
I think it's Thursday nights. Is that true?
It's Thursday nights, and I want to say they do a 6 o'clock start.
Okay.
I've only been to one of them, so my memory is a little hazy as to.
Yeah.
I'm in this room a lot. It all runs together.
I understand. And it is here then? It's not.
It is here. It's also available online, just like everything else we do. So,
Yeah.
people can zoom into. And Andrew provides the staff support, so, it's a familiar face on that end as well.
Well, I'll suggest that we table this until we have the opportunity to talk to Gary. Unless Kim wants to jump in right away, I'm not hearing an urgent need from the town that we reappoint this right away, so I'll just make that as a friendly suggestion that we just wait until Gary's back.
I'm okay with that. I'm unable to commit to adding additional meetings to my schedule at this point. So otherwise I would
Yeah,
I'm interested,
Yeah, same.
topically interested.
yeah.
Same for me. I guess I just had a question for Matt. Matt, do you know if they have anything um particularly urgent, I guess, or large that they're considering right now on that committee that should have Conservation Commission involvement?
I think there's a couple of big picture things that have been under discussion for a while and will continue to be, but nothing imminent needs to be made in terms of like a decision on those. So I think if you're aware at all, there's work on a management plan and sort of a long-term plan for trails and facilities there.
It's neat.
I'll let you in read. And then there's just the month to month is really managing the ongoing relationship between the family center as a licensee on the property and the town as owner, and just talking over any logistics related to town events and family center events that are happening on the property and coordinating around those things. So there's big stuff going on, but none of it is going to come to a head in the next month or anything like that. So totally fine if you want to have that conversation and go into your next meeting on that.
Okay.
Is it legit for me to talk to Gary at work about this, or is that violating meeting law in some capacity?
It just doesn't help us appoint him. You can talk to him, but
Yeah.
Yeah, you're okay. You're okay under open meeting law. It's non-quorum, and you're not a quasi judicial body, so there's no ex parte issue if you want to do that.
Okay, super. I'll
Yeah,
just try to figure out what if he's interested and
You
yeah.
can definitely bend his arm as far back as you can, Kim.
I don't want to bend his arm. I want to make sure I'm not like stepping on his toes or like taking something away from him that he's really interested in.
yeah, we know he has
Great.
interest right in the area
Of
and
course.
the forestry aspects and stuff too. So
Yeah.
it's worth having a conversation, Kim.
Great. So
Yeah.
Kim and Gary will talk offline and we'll table this until our next meeting. I have a question, which is just for Matt, is confirming that the vacancy for the Conservation Commission, has that been posted as an open volunteer position yet?
I will take a look right now. Yes, it has.
Okay, great. Sounds good. So we just wait for someone to raise their hands. And if anyone knows anyone, good time for recruitment.
Yeah, and yes, definitely for the Conservation Commission, I think it's really for all the committees we serve, it's just nice to have a full board, and you all know, just maintaining quorum and stuff like that. It's very helpful. It's very helpful to us. So if you know somebody, tell them now's their chance.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay, then with that covered, the next item on the agenda is ERF investment, labeled August 1st. And I do not know what this agenda is at all.
Sure. So I'm trying to talk and bring up the email from our finance director at the same time,
Okay.
so bear with me for a second.
Were Kim or I emailed on that?
I don't think you were. I think
Okay.
it just went to Andrew. And what this has to do with is we invest the Environmental Reserve Fund in CDs.
Yeah,
And we have one that I think is coming up for renewal, or we would have access to it August 1st, and the question is about reinvesting it. And the longer we reinvest it, of course, the better the rate. And I think the choice was 6 months or a year. So if I can find that, I can just give you the particulars. And I think Shirley was just looking for advice.
I actually thought we covered that in the May meeting, or maybe it was June. I'd have to go back to the minutes. I thought we covered this.
I think there were two
There's two.
investments, so
Yeah,
one of
okay.
them turned over and we made a decision, and I thought there was another one coming, I didn't know when, maybe this is the.
I believe this is it. Apologize for working out of my email on this, but.
While Matt's looking up his email, does anyone have any differences of opinion from what we covered in the spring? Any discussion from the commission on this?
We don't have
Fine.
any, we don't have any projects in the works, right? At the moment.
Correct. So I mean, that's, really what the question is there a reason that you would want access to this piece of the ERF sooner than in the next 6, 8, or 12 months? And
For a purchase for something to go from concept to purchase would take months,
Yeah.
not weeks, so, I don't have any concerns with reinvesting it, also if it's a CD. Type investment, is that right?
yes,
We just lose the interest if we pull it out, so it's
Right.
not the end of the world.
right. So my recommendation would be, unless you have something imminent or in progress that you're planning on, if we started working with a landowner tomorrow where we were interested in easement purchase and we said, well, we have money, but we won't have it until 8 months from now, that's fine. For the way the town's piece of a funding package goes, it's just fine. And I'm sorry, I cannot find this thread between Andrew and Shirley about this, but it's a CD. We would plug it back in after 8/1 and we would have it again.
Is anybody opposed to a motion that simply says we should move forward with reinvesting in the highest rate CD available? No more than 18 months or something like that, or no more than 12 months, whatever the longest.
I'd like to see what the actual options are. I support someone putting a motion to that extent. Reed, I just
Yeah.
kind of want to be specific as to what the town's offering. Is.
Yeah.
Is it for, I assume it's for some percentage of the balance of what we have in the balance or in the
It is.
ERF, or is it? It's not the whole
It's
thing,
not,
right?
yeah, it's not all of it. Have Andrew telling me about it.
I'm gonna look real quick, see if he sent anything to me. No. So I guess, so we'll have to be sort of broad in a motion that might carry today without any specifics on the. Sounds like Andrew had the email and maybe didn't send it to Matt.
So, okay, I have Andrew's notes here, which he did send me, even better. Sorry.
Cool.
So we have two $200,000 CDs. The one we're talking about will mature on August 1st. It was a 1 year. And the question is, would we want to renew that? And do you want to do 9 months or 1 year? In the context of, are there any plans to spend ERF right now? The longer the term, the better the rates. We could look for a 6-month CD rate, although it would definitely be less. The other 200,000 was renewed in May for a year.
Yeah.
So,
What are the rates right now? That's okay.
It's okay.
I
You don't
don't
have it written down.
Higher than 9 months, certainly higher than 6 months.
yeah,
I'll move we reinvest in the 12-month CD for this chunk.
Thank you, Reed.
Second.
All right.
Kim second.
In a second, we have a active motion. I'll call for a vote. All in favor of the motion to extend 200,000 of the ERF into a 1-year CD?
I, sounds
Aye.
good.
Opposed? Hearing none. Motion carries. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you for bearing with me while I
It's fine.
revealed my woeful unpreparedness for answering that.
Right now, I have approximately 2,000 tabs open on my computer, so I appreciate that.
Well, I've been working out of my phone because I haven't been in the office much the last 2 weeks. And so I open things, I see them, my brain knows I've seen them, but forgets
Yeah.
where and how. So it was in a Word document that Andrew had
I
sent.
hear you.
Great.
All right, so I think the next up 2 items are your agenda for reviewing the 2 chapters of the town plan that are currently in development: rural land use and subdivision design and conservation areas. In my review of the 2 chapters last night, I believe this committee is going to have the most to say on the conservation areas.
Mhm.
And I wanted to poll the committee if there's a strong preference on the order of this discussion, because we could probably spend all of our time on conservation areas chapter alone. So that was my suggestion, was that we cover that one first and then move on to subdivision design, because that might actually have to get split up between this and the next meeting.
Sure.
That's fine with me, unless Matt needs us to look at the other chapter first for whatever reason on their schedule, but that's fine with me.
No, so I don't want to repeat anything Andrew's talked to you about the town plan, but we're in this sort of rolling iteration of all of these various topic areas, most of which will become chapters of the town plan. We're hoping late fall, early winter to get a sort of a text version of this plan draft to the select board so we can go over the high points and sort of if there are any major policy shifts that the plan considers, we talk about those well in advance. And the plan needs to be adopted by the select board before the end of August of 2025. So we're still a year out, but wanting to really take our time on these chapters. And in terms of conservation areas, the one thing I would intro the topic with is just to say that there were a few big takeaways from our public engagement process back in the fall. And one of those was definitely that people in Williston really support, appreciate, and want to continue to see open space conservation in town. Not super surprising, but nice to hear that feedback and
More clear than we've heard it at times.
I think
Sometimes it's
so.
been a more muddled message. I mean, the 2050 was a large enough survey to tell that it was more clear.
Yeah. So I think that kind of informs some of what's in this draft. And I don't know where you want to, if you want me, I can screen share, we can look at text, or we can just kind of talk about the concepts in it, whatever works for folks.
And I'm happy to screen
Yeah,
share.
why don't you do that and I'll
You can enable
give
my
you
sharing.
privileges.
I think it's always nice to have something to look at that we're both on.
I support the
everyone's on the
conservation
same-
areas first, to your point, David, especially because there's some overlap. I believe if I'm recalling between the two, there's some areas where the same notes show up in both because we weren't quite exactly sure which comments would go be attached to the subdivision design aspect and which ones would get attached to the conservation areas. So if we go through the conservation areas first, then we can just look through the one later and skip over things that we've already discussed.
Great.
Yeah,
Let's do it.
that's another important point is just mechanically, we're working on all these different topic areas. And especially when we get into the implementation structure where we go, objectives, strategies and actions, we fully expect once we consolidate those, which I have somebody working on, that we're going to see overlap and we're going to see similarly worded objectives in multiple chapters and actions that serve objectives in multiple chapters. And we're gonna look at that structurally and try to merge those things together, and reorganize on that principle as we go forward. So overlap is fine and repetition is fine at this stage. So if you see something, you go, oh, well, wouldn't that also be in rural land use, or wouldn't that also be in the land use chapter? Yeah, it probably would be, and we'll take care of that.
Mhm.
Great. Thanks for sharing.
Yep.
By the way, I don't know that I ever actually got SharePoint access to drop comments in.
I'll make sure you do.
Yeah, and sounded like Andrew was trying to set that up for the whole committee. But I didn't end up
I
getting
had
that.
one of them I was able to get into, the other I couldn't, and then I didn't go back and retry.
All right.
Yeah, if
I'll
anybody's
just say
having,
that I think because UVM is a Teams campus, that it's like wonky on my computer. Like it like wants to revert to my
My work account wants
UV,
to log
like
in.
my like automatic UVM share. I don't know. It's just Google works better. I don't know why. Bummer.
yeah, let us know if you're having any issues, and we've done some back end work for others, trying to make sure people can get into these and comment on them, so.
All right, so let's get into it then. Matt, what was your thought for how we would roll through this? Did you want to give any overviews of staff? Should we just cover this item by item?
I think I'll just kind of give you a brief sort of summary of some of like the conversations that have been floating around about open space and land conservation in town, and kind of how it fits with the rest of the plan, and then maybe just skim through the document.
All right.
You know, in a really broad sense in the town plan, when we think about conserving land that will not be developed, when we have conversations about the working landscape or the landscape that is being conserved by these efforts, it gets really interesting. We've had some conversations with the Planning Commission about, well, which landscape are we conserving? Which kind of working land are we conserving? Are we targeting what Williston looked like 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 150 years ago, 50 years ago? The only constant, and the planners encounter this all the time, right, is change. And so really what's been great about this town plan effort is some of the really big philosophical conversations about why are we doing this? Is it aesthetics? Is it environmental quality? Is it not wanting lots of people to live in certain parts of town? Is it wanting to preserve recreation opportunities or a connection to farming? And it's really a little bit of all of those things. So it's been great to step back in a full plan rewrite like this and really talk about the why. And to talk about some of the places where, you know, conservation can rub up against, for example, housing goals. Williston's land use regime and its willingness to dedicate resources to taking land out of development potential also means that, you know, especially in rural Williston, not everybody who wants to live in rural Williston is going to be able to live in rural Williston. We're not going to set up a land use regime or unlock land that allows for the kind of development activity that would make that possible. And generally, those things also mean that we've made having a home in rural Williston really pretty expensive. If you really want to live there, that we're talking about somebody who's really got some significant resources at this point. And
especially if you want to move there.
Especially if you want to move there now.
If you had the land in your family, it might not be as expensive, but for a new resident to become a rural Willistonian is not a cheap process.
Right. And so, that doesn't mean we ought to scrap this whole long tradition of land conservation and zoning for open space in rural Williston, but it is an interesting perspective, and it's one to think about. Well, this area, as far as a place where you could own a home, is becoming much more exclusive than it ever has been. what's the counterbalance to that? And, my personal view is the counterbalance to that is public access to public lands. It's making the area walkable and bikeable for people who are out there. I had a long conversation with somebody about, biking on rural roads in Williston. And, we have these roads that serve a transportation purpose, but they also allow for access to that part of town without having to afford to live there. Because you can go biking or running on those roads, and you can get into these conservation lands, and you can benefit from the fact that there are working farms out there that often have some kind of public interaction, whether it's something like Isham Farm or Adams Farm, et cetera. So that's been the really big, broad conversation. And you see that in section 2 here, where it says, why do we conserve land in Williston? And I think it's really great to get an opportunity to delve into that, because, certainly when I came to Williston 16 years ago as a planner, my ideas around this were much more rigid. Conserving land in rural places is always good. Open space is always better than development. Concentrating everything in a center is always better. And then, you start interacting with reality, and you start interacting with the fact that not every single member of the public has those exact same preferences. You start seeing the volume, the size and scope of the housing crisis we're in at this point. You start thinking about other things, and this spun off in several different directions with the planning commission over the last couple of meetings. And we talked a little bit too about, well, rural Williston actually also coincides with some geological realities. Generally poor soils, not great water supply, some things that actually mean maybe this isn't the best land to have a bunch of houses on. Okay, great. So your conservation can also be informed by the idea that develop there, not here, because here's not just a place that looks nice, but it's not really a great place to develop. So backing out and doing all that was really great. And then diving into the chapter, and but I like the idea of that really, really like 10,000, 100,000 foot view, and really try to connect this with the rest of the plan. And even questioning some of our most core sort of assumptions and values about this stuff is worthwhile to do in the context of a once every 8-year town plan. Way better to do it now than at the DRB.
Right. How will this chapter influence decisions in the Conservation Commission, the Planning Commission, and the DRB? All three of those commissions seem to have oversight over planning. So how will we be looking at the plan when it's written to sort of know how to make our decisions?
Well, I think let's start with the Planning Commission, because they're the ones who would be, considering changes to the regulatory regime. I don't think there's much in here that says stop doing what you're doing, stop requiring 75% open space or anything like that. There's strong support for those current policies to continue to do things like cluster rural development, have good conservation design, all those kinds of things. Honestly, I would be fine with a town plan that just said, keep regulating the ag rural district the way you have been. One of the things we talk about, and I think it's in the, it's in one of these 2 chapters, I think, is should that open space requirement start to be applied to smaller parcels? So right now it's if you're subdividing a 10.5 acre or greater parcel, you have that open space requirement.
Well, it's 9.
Yeah, if you're subdividing 10.4, you don't. And very rarely we'll even see somebody do a boundary line adjustment to create a threshold parcel to stay out of the open space requirement. And you got to set a line somewhere. Or, I guess you could say every single subdivision is subject to 75% open space. It gets a little tougher to do at smaller scales, but there's some mapping that this plan could call for the town to do to start thinking about the potential of what if we adjusted that. I don't know that you could get away with requiring a higher percentage of open space than 75%. That's incredibly assertive. It's as far as we know, the most assertive open space requirement in the state. But I think there's a lot of support here for what the town has been doing. And, the other thing is, and as the Conservation Commission, rural subdivision has really kind of dwindled to a trickle at this point, in Williston. We don't see a lot of, certainly not a lot of large rural
We've seen like
subdivisions
two
anymore.
a year or something.
Yeah.
It's like very, and some of those are adding two.
Right.
Yeah.
Two homes, some of those are just adding one home in addition to what's there. They're very small.
Yeah.
You had a question, Reed?
Well,
Comment?
yeah, my comments maybe takes us backward a little bit into what you were talking about, Matt, but when I think about, I hadn't thought about the soils aspect, and I was, I have conversations with Chapin all the time since we lived together, and he was bringing up the soils aspect because the first thing that came to mind to me was, we've been talking about trying to shorten driveways and prevent fragmentation when doing cluster development. Don't have it back 200 yards into the forest. Let's get it up closer to the main road. But that conflicts with the rural character aspect that most people like to drive along the road and not see the houses. They want them screened. So we have as a town, we have a little bit of a trade-off to consider there. But one of the things that ideas that I've been thinking about a lot is, could we find a way to add multifamily housing in a rural setting that keeps the rural character? So things like building what looks like a barn, but really has 4 units in it. Higher efficiency because they have shared walls, so it meets some of our energy type goals for the town. Potential for people to work there that are working on farms. So housing for workforce could be some of our needs could be met there. And the rural character aspect, people like seeing barns. A lot of our barns are falling into disrepair to the point where they may end up just ending being bulldozed because they're not safe and not repairable. So is there a possibility that some of those farms that aren't using their barns anymore could renovate their barn or replace their barn with something that looks similar in terms of character, but actually meets other things? Most barns are up against the road because you needed to get materials in and out, and you didn't want to maintain lots of infrastructure like long driveways and things. So that's something that I've been thinking about. But if you want to allow something like more density, if it keeps rural character, if it's up against a road, if you agree to keep the land open, whether you're haying it or whatever, that comes with challenges in terms of the soils, things like parking, septic. Those are issues that have to be dealt with. But that's something I've been thinking about. I was wondering what other commissioners thought about. How would you feel about something in the next town plan that said the town should explore feasibility of allowing higher density, that if it kind of like form-based code, if it keeps the agricultural appearance of our rural landscape?
Yeah, we've had some things about density imposed on us by the legislature in the last 2 years, more so related to areas that are served by water and sewer, although places that had single family only zoning in their rural areas, which Williston did not. We've always allowed duplexes. Also now have to allow duplexes everywhere they allow a single family home. And as those preemptions have come to pass, I think there's a conversation, we've talked about it with the planning commission of, you have to allow a lot as small as essentially 2/10 of an acre, and you have to allow up to a fourplex on it in areas served by water and sewer. When you start doing that, if you start saying, if you say 2/10 of an acre is single family only, most of the design issues work themselves out because there's just sort of a layout that makes sense. When you say that same lot could also have a fourplex on it, well, where are we going to park people? Are we putting the trash in a structure, or are we going to have 4 trash cans in the driveway? How are we handling access? How are we handling doors? Things like that. So you know, there's a conversation about if we get more creative with density, do we start to also impose more requirements on design? And that's me sort of summarizing what I'm hearing you say. I will say, Reed, and if anybody's interested, I'll try and find it. A guy a bunch of years ago at a conference I went to in Maine presented on a rural form-based code that a consultant developed for them, and they were looking at, you know, traditional patterns of development that a lot of those small farmsteads in Maine were multifamily already. You know, and some of it was the big house, little house, back house, barn pattern, and some of it was there were other things like the farmhouse or the barn right up on the road with the open land behind that they were able to recognize and say, well, this is actually what our landscape is. And if you drove in behind this barn that's right up on the road, and instead of the backside of a barn, it was, you know, 4 condo units, that's actually, you know, not really a shocking change to the landscape. So I think there is room to talk about efforts like that. And also I'll just remind everybody that we did make some bylaw changes in November designed to be more supportive of the creation of housing. And we did talk a little bit in those changes about things like worker housing for farms and allowing things more than a duplex on those properties and things like that. And we do have a provision for you can have more than a duplex if it's in a restored historic barn. That's been in the bylaw for 15 years now, and nobody's ever accessed it. Those projects are really
Expensive projects.
really, really expensive. Doesn't mean somebody might not do it someday, but yeah, you know, and that tension you mentioned about the big long driveway, we can hide the houses in the woods if we build a 1/4 mile driveway, and then we won't have to see them from the road, and no one will ever know there was development that happened is one way of looking at things. And another way is to say, yeah, but now we built a big long driveway and we put a bunch of houses in the woods, and if we put them down by the road, they'd be visible, but they'd be maybe less impactful on the resource. So there can be tension between the aesthetics and the perception of what is rural. And you know, the just sort of what functionally might make more sense. So there's room, you know, the chapters in the town plan don't have to resolve all these questions. What they will need to do is call for the work efforts that the staff and the Conservation Commission, other committees might make over the next 8 years with a general goal of, well, what's the, you know, I've been using the idea that in these chapters, the goals end up being how does this chapter address the livable, resilient, equitable framework? And living under that broad set of goals is the objectives, which is what does Williston look like in 2050 if we're doing this right? And under that are the strategies and actions. So the strategy might be, let's audit our bylaw and let's think about ways that, you know, we could achieve this balance better. You know, and both here and in sort of the more suburban parts of Williston, it's really been a tough conversation about imposing design requirements on those areas, particularly on single family homes. You know, we have that conversation all the time about should we be pushing people's garage doors, you know, back from the facade of the houses, because it, you know, puts the people in the house sort of more prominent on the street and the cars a little less. And then you go, wow, but we're really telling somebody like how they can build their house now. And what's the appetite for doing that? Or is it only in big projects that we're willing to do that, but not like, you know, the single homeowner who's just building themselves a house? So all of that I see parallels to what you might talk about in the ag rural. And again, you don't have to resolve it all here, but we want to start identifying the work items and really, you know, our hope as a staff is to take this town plan away once it's adopted and really look at that 8-year arc and talk about our long range work plan and our priorities for coming back and helping all of our committees work through those big questions.
I wanted to ask the commissioners if there's any other comments on Matt's opening statements. I was. Go ahead.
You know what? I can't remember how to raise my hand. I'm sorry. This is Laura here. And I just had a question for Matt. When you say you're talking about restored historic barns, is it still in the town plan that you have to restore a barn to a specific historic level, or can and if it is, can the next town plan say, as I think Reed mentioned, you could restore it. It won't be as expensive to do to something that looks similar.
Yeah, so the current plan really limits those provisions to a quote unquote restored historic barn, which actually means it needs to be a structure that's been listed in the state inventory. It's a little fuzzy on what restored really means, but it would mean that a historic preservation expert was saying, this project is, it's still a barn when we're done with it. The further idea that Reed brought up, which is like, well, what if you have a place where there was a barn, or maybe even a place where there wasn't a barn, but you're building something to that design standard? None of that is really contained in the plan or the bylaws right now. So, the plan could say something like, research ways that the zoning bylaw could balance, greater density or more multifamily in rural places by requiring traditional design or design elements. And, you just say it in kind of plain English, like, we're kind of okay with this if it replicates this traditional pattern and
Barn
isn't,
silos and farmhouses. That's what people are used to seeing.
I mean, you can build a big farmhouse that looks like a big farmhouse from the road and is a fourplex when you walk inside of it. And, if you start looking for multifamily in rural Vermont, you'll actually see quite a lot of it. It's just often, it's just not visually jarring. So the plan could call for a project to look at that. And say, we think this might be a solution, might be a way to strike a balance, might be a way that some more folks could live out here, while still having it be this collectively, enjoyed and valued, landscape that the town has worked so hard to hang on to.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I wanted to go into the document, and I know of particular interest for the members of this commission is the ERF. And
go to that section.
Yes, I think we should. There's a section called Future Conservation through Easements and Acquisitions. This one really stood out to me. And I thought,
let's see, goals, same here.
it should be not telling me the page numbers.
Maintenance. Oh, here we go. Create new conservation areas. No, that's not it.
No,
It's on page 4.
Okay, we're too far down. There, future conservation through easements and acquisitions. Yeah, there.
thanks.
Mhm.
So there's a lot in this section that I thought we should talk about. And I'll open it up, but my first observation are this recommendation to conserve 30% of Vermont by 2030. And looks like we have this, Williston will conserve 30% of its land area through conservation easements and land acquisition by 2030. That's an 87.5% increase in the amount of land that is currently conserved.
Yeah, that date didn't feel in line with our prior conversations about this. We hadn't set a specific date, but like when we went and presented to the select board, Eric, I think we basically said we intend to get to 30%, but not on the 2030 timescale, because it just wasn't it wasn't logistically feasible for Williston.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. In fact, I think I guess maybe we didn't talk about an exact date, but I was thinking 30% by 2050.
That was in my mind too. Yeah.
It would not seem practical or feasible or within the realm of reality to get to 30% by 2030 if we
have to have a major land acquisition.
And money to do it.
Yeah, like how many Catamount Community Forests would you need to close on every year to actually get to that level?
Is everybody comfortable with more of a 2050 timeframe? Do we still have Kim? I can't see everybody.
She was going to rejoin. She's in transit.
Laura, I see your hand.
Yes.
Oh, she's indicating
She's
yes,
saying
she's
yeah.
comfortable with that. Right. I also wanted to poke at some of the I mean, it's a provocative suggestion, but later in this section, there's an action of funding the ERF through a penny on the tax rate. This is not something the commissions, we've heard about these. We had a guest from Shelburne come to us in the winter, and this was something that they said they used to do. I can't recall if it was reapproved or not, but where did this how did this sort of end up in the draft plan, Matt? And is that something you want to talk about with this group?
Well, so in a really general sense, there's a couple of areas in where the town has goals that cost money, where the cost goes up all the time, and where it seems the experience has been it's very difficult to sustain funding for those efforts through yearly budget conversations. In other words, we can run the town with or without putting money in the ERF every year. And so when budgets get tight, it's one of the first things to go. So
I was impressed anything stayed this year.
yeah, so so the idea of kind of tying yourself to the mast and committing to funding for certain things that are otherwise kind of seen as discretionary. And the big ones in Williston that we've talked about have been housing, bike ped infrastructure, and open space. And each of those, particularly open space and bike ped, are things that neighboring communities have done through, putting some amount of money on the tax rate that's specifically dedicated to that purpose. So, South Burlington has had the penny for paths. I think Burlington did penny for parks. And a penny on the rate gets you some couple $100,000 a year.
I wanted to say it was 300.
Yeah.
300 and change or something.
So when we say penny, is that just 1%?
It's a penny per $100 of assessed
Okay.
value.
Okay.
So
Okay.
our overall tax rate in Williston, I'm gonna get it not quite right, but it's about 35 cents per $100 of assessed value. And so you say, well, what if instead of 35 cents, we were at 36 cents? And that extra penny was only for a particular purpose. So, saying it has to be a penny or something like that isn't really as critical in the plan as saying this is something there's been some interest bubbling up in exploring what would it mean to have some dedicated funding around these things that are otherwise sort of the first to go when the budget gets tight, or difficult to amass money on. And the nice thing is, as your grand list gets bigger, your penny generates more revenue, and it stays a little more parallel to cost. So in my case, living in South Burlington, there was actually kind of a reckoning about 5 years into penny for paths, where the city council said, well, wait a minute, that's pulling in way more money now because our grand list got bigger. Should we reduce it? And the bike ped committee went to the city council and said, well, have you looked at the price of asphalt lately? These improvements that we're trying to make are getting more and more expensive every year. It's actually good that this fund is growing. So it brings a little bit more sustainability to those kinds of efforts. And it brings a more sort of year to year commitment. So if you're on that decision-making body, the select board, and you've got a bunch of citizens saying, don't raise my taxes, you've got to cut your budget. If there's just line items in the budget and you're trying to hit a percentage target, you start to look at like, what are the easy things to cut? If it's more like, well, we've got this money, but we've really sort of set it aside and we don't touch it, even when times are tight, we look to economize elsewhere. Over time, the theory would be that, that funding is more sustainable.
Sure. So I want to go back to the numbers that were just kind of being thrown around so that I'm clear on it, and then others should weigh in too. So if the effect is to add 1 penny on the assessed value per $100, so if you're paying 34 cents and it then goes up to 35 cents, is that the equivalent of like a 3% increase on on your overall tax burden? Like, is that the
Something
effect?
like that.
It's about like that, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
There was so I shared with David and Kim, I had a conversation with Jean on from the select board, and one of the things she brought up was, is there gonna be a penny for paths proposal? And she seems supportive
Mhm.
of it, and one of the things that she mentioned that's an interesting perspective is she said you could actually say it's a penny for the ERF and for our other conservation line item on the operating budget, so it could also be for equipment
Mhm.
and trail maintenance, things like that. So if that could be a way to present it as actually taking some stuff out of the some more stuff out of the operating
Mhm.
budget, and say it's not just that we're going to put all this money into the ERF, that, and I don't know if it's even legitimate to do this, but I was wondering whether there could be discretion, basically that the Conservation Commission could allocate from that penny a certain amount in a given year is going to go into the ERF, and a certain amount is going to be used for conservation projects. And that would give us even more flexibility if we, had a major trail revision that was required, we could put a little less in the ERF that year.
Yeah, I think, there's lots of freedom to set up a structure, particularly where the WCC becomes advisory on that, and similarly, if we had a piece of it that was going towards housing, the housing committee would advise on that, or we would just be dumping it into the trust fund, which they already advise on. So it's really a commitment that the town kind of creates for itself and then decides how it wants to manage. And, the plan, again, doesn't have to necessarily settle on a percentage point or an exact list of what the funding is for. It's more, is this an idea worth exploring? And I've heard similar interest from the manager's office that, Eric's getting some feedback from the select board that they're hearing this conversation. They want to have it. They want to understand it better. And the town plans, as good an opportunity as any to sort of, talk through it at a high level. And then, if it's something we want to explore, the plan calls for us to go ahead and do that. The math part is easy. I can tell you how much money it raises.
Yeah, you just take the grand list and divide it by 100,
Yeah,
basically.
I like Reed's idea a lot. I really think with our trails in the shape they're in, and there's a lot that
Demand.
yeah, we need to do to them. I think that is just a great idea.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a very creative concept, Reed. Nice job. And I like the idea of giving some if yield giving some more control to the Conservation Commission. And I guess if that were to come to fruition, it would be most likely a Conservation Commission rec doesn't receive, but there are X amount of dollars allocated through that penny on the tax, whatever, or penny on the tax rate, or whatever you want to call it, each year, and the conservation makes a recommendation to the select board, I guess, as to how those dollars would be allocated into the ERF versus operating costs. I think that's a great idea.
would that be also jurisdictionally under the planning commission, because the planning commission has more of the role on things like placement of pathways and the like?
so when we get into paths, trails, sidewalks, multi-use paths.
Yeah.
We had a really good conversation with the planning commission last night about working on the official map as a major effort that the plan will likely call for. And I think on the primitive paths and the paths that interact with the conservation areas and the country parks, the planning commission is always going to look to the WCC for advice and effort around that. The nice thing about the official map is we start to connect that up with the more sort of hardscape system that exists along the roadways, or that we get when we have new development coming in, the multi-use paths and sidewalks. So there was a lot of recognition in the conversation we had last night that there's a lot more work to do. It was great that we got an official map adopted in 2020. It's great that what we have on there is town-wide, but we know we have more work to do there. And I think both bodies would be part of that. And we really were, it's so easy to spiral out. You bring that map up and you start saying, well, this thing's a sidewalk, but really it ought to be an 8 foot wide multi-use path, so it's easier to plow. And this thing's a primitive trail, but it's actually getting heavy enough use that maybe it's a piece of the bike path system someday, that sort of thing. Again, the plan would call for that effort, but not necessarily try to resolve all the questions right away.
Would say assess trail usage and types to periodically to keep them in line with usage or town needs or something.
But I think there's a vision that bike ped system is more interconnected, more easily, more seamless from different parts of town, and that we're both filling gaps where we can, and also making big progress where we can. So there's a lot of conversation last night on the multi-use side about connecting Taft Corners to the village, something we're actually going to be going back and looking at the scoping of again in this current fiscal year. So there's kind of big stuff and little stuff in that conversation. I don't know if that's answering the question, but
When was the last time the town had to acquire land in order to build a bike path?
I think it was the one connecting over to that church across the Allen Brook, wasn't it?
yeah, I think
On
it
2A.
was. So behind Meadow Run, coming down to where Annex is being built.
So I guess the reason I asked that is because can the ERF be put to use for something like that purchase, or does it have to? Because when I read the ERF, like, pecking order, that didn't fit the bill.
Yeah, I mean, the ERF prioritization has typically really been about, habitat value and environmental quality, right?
Yeah.
If there was a broader idea around a funding source that said, well, this is paths and trails and it's, land and it's all
There's
those
a deer
things.
wintering area back in there, so like if we were buying the land to preserve that area, and we said, well, there's also a high traffic path that we can get off the road, we might allow a multi-use path through it or something.
Right. So the other thing that came up last night I wanted to touch on real briefly is that, when the official map was adopted in 2020, we really focused on, we need this to underpin the form-based code area in Taft Corners, because we're starting to dictate where streets go, and we need to start dictating where urban parks will go, because we know we won't get them unless we put them on the map. So outside of the form-based code area, the official map documented desired and or scoped and planned and existing sidewalks, paths, and trails. We didn't identify any land as a future public facility, future public land outside of the form-based code area. But that's a tool that's available to the town, and I think the plan is going to call for that revised official map to start looking at, are there particular pieces of land that the town wants to, put a target on and say, hey, if this land comes in for development, this
first
piece,
right of refusal.
yeah, we want an opportunity to purchase. Before the developer considers developing it, we want an opportunity to purchase. So this is, in my opinion, the very most direct way the town can express what it wants. Because, the official map process says if it's on the map, the developer either must accommodate it, meaning don't put houses on it. Or if they don't want to accommodate it, they have to give the select board 120 days to decide if they want to try and purchase it from them. So that's that right of first refusal idea. The other nice thing about that, when you start talking about land, is rather than identifying somebody's parcel and say, well, the Smith farm, it's got some really high quality stuff on it, let's turn the whole Smith farm parcel green. You say, well, actually the Smith farm and the Jones farm next to it in this particular area have a deer wintering area. Let's map that. And then when Smith comes in to subdivide, you say, well, not only do we have rules that say you should stay out of deer wintering area, we actually have that as a planned future public facility. We want to obtain that from you, and we want you to not develop on it. And so you're doing more research ahead of time and you're really pre-identifying those pieces of land that you want. And you might identify some because of habitat value, you might identify some because of high aesthetic value, and you might identify some and say, this needs a path through it. You know, it's the land, but really it's also the path right of way that we're looking for. So
I see Laura's hand up.
lots of opportunity there.
Laura?
Hi, thank you. I had an idea, and while pieces of land are great to pinpoint, why can't we have developers think of the bike path as a linear park and require them to, it doesn't have to be necessarily a green space, but if you put a space where people can pull over that has shade, that could be like right up against a building, but that we're calling a public park. You see this a lot in New York City on Broadway. You see public parks on every large skyscraper, and people are using them all the time. And you say, okay, you need to put something here where people at your business could go have lunch at, and it would be pleasant. It's not just a bench out in the sun. It is an actual public park.
Yeah, I think, Laura, we're you know, today, if we said we were calling for a multi-use path as part of somebody's development, we're talking about, you know, 12 feet of pavement in some, you know, sort of like a 20-foot wide right of way, and that's really all that specification is. To draw a parallel, though, to what we do in the form-based code, you know, we developed these whole new street specifications, right, that included green belts, tree spacing, you know, soil requirements for tree planting. You know, it's an entire section with a specified design. So this is a little bit tangential, maybe, but certainly related to official map, would be to start thinking about the quality of those, especially I think the multi-use paths like you're talking about, where you might actually draw and eventually adopt a typical section that says, I mean, we have nothing today that says a multi-use path has trees alongside it. And you could say that. You could say, you know, a multi-use path needs to exist in a 20-foot wide easement. There's a tree every 30 feet on either side of it. You could also develop a typical section for, you know, pocket park that happens alongside that path. Today, those conversations, for example, the development of the path through what was the Essex Alliance Church property will now be the annex. We had a lot of staff level conversations with the developer about the quality of the path and particularly the park in the project and appropriate size and scale, given the size and scale of the development. But it was all us as staff kind of taking everything we've heard from the public process and from, you know, commissions like yourselves over the years, and then trying to feed that to the developer and then really looking down and hammering it out. In other words, we didn't have a standard or a specification to say this park or path meets or doesn't meet something. It was more like, this is what people are telling us they want.
Laura, I want to, I see your hand up, but I would like to bring the conversation back to the chapter that we're. Go ahead, Laura.
Oh, thanks. I just wanted to say one more thing. I just wanted to mention that when the planners are getting together and talking about these things, that there's to keep in mind, and I'm sure you do, that our summers are getting hotter and so are our winters, and whatever infrastructure there is, I just think we have to be prepared for spaces where people can stay cool. That's all.
Yep.
Thanks. I do want to bring it back to the ERF conversation. So my takeaway from this is that the action item as it's reflected in this plan, and again, this is sort of like there's an urgent need now, which is, you know, Reed, you're sort of alluding to, is that, you know, there's interest on the select board, and then there's, well, this recommendation could end up in the town plan, which is, clearly a multi-year exploration of what would a sort of formal, depending on the tax rate or otherwise, sort of look like. And that seems like there could be a disconnect there in terms of the timing. And is this an urgent need now question versus we can, because I'm sure that this plan is filled with things like this, right? And the priority of getting to the resolution of this particular one may or may not be on the highest on the list.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no harm in putting it in. It only does good to put it into the upcoming town plan, even if we try to pursue it sooner.
Mhm.
And I think if we were to look at our current town plan, we would find that funding the ERF is an important component of the current town plan. And so I think as a commission, we have the latitude to say we're not going to wait for the new town plan to do something that we feel is aligned with the current town plan. There's already been conversations over the last few years about our struggles with getting funding, discretionary funding for the ERF. So I don't think it precludes us from working on it now. And if the new town plan comes in and we're already halfway done working on this, that's fine. That's my view.
I do think also, Matt, that the conversation we just had points to a much broader need for the type of conservation than just what the ERF is. And so this recommendation that it be specific to the ERF may need to be broadened, for example.
Or appears similarly in other sections. Maybe a section that
Yeah.
talks about a funding stream to support bike. I don't know if it already is planned, but a funding stream to support bike ped infrastructure. Where it's not going to be built as part of development anyway.
Right.
Yeah, so structurally, one of the things I expect to happen as we pull the implementation items out of all these chapters and start looking at them together is we're gonna see objectives that are similar. Like there might be 2 or 3 places that say a dedicated funding stream is what will make this go. What we're gonna try to do is consolidate that into one objective. And then feed it back to the chapters and tag it and say, this is actually an objective in several areas. And it would serve a whole bunch of different needs. And that way, we don't go to the select board and have 3 conversations about dedicated funding stream. We go and we have one conversation about that idea, going forward. And so there's a bunch of things that I think are going to happen that way where, there's things in the land use chapter that are also in the discussion of open space, for example, where we're going to say, oh, actually, we're all talking about the same thing here. And that may also elevate some of those objectives or strategies in terms of their priority. Like, wow, if we really get off the ground with a conversation and maybe even a vote on dedicated funding stream, we make progress in several areas that people told us were really important to them. About living in Williston. So it's a little nebulous right now, but I actually have somebody working on extracting all of the action items out of these plan chapters and putting them in a table, and then we'll feed that back. And I think there are things like this that rise to the top where you go, wow, like if we were to apply a rating system to this, there's a lot of public support for the things this would do. And there's like a bunch of different areas where you can achieve goals in this draft plan if we take this on. So that's coming as well. It's just a big organizational effort, and it's a bit of a moving target as all the chapters are in various stages of draft right now.
Great. Thanks for that explanation. Any other well, let's see, I just do a time check here. It's 8:16. At 8:30, we have a guest, I believe, Chase, to talk about Master Naturalist Program at Mud Pond. And I feel like have only sort of scratched the surface on one of the major topics in this, but there are others, and I want to see if anyone's review of this chapter has, if there are any burning sections of this that people wanted to talk about.
Yeah, if I can cut in, sorry, like, or I can't find my raise hand thing, but so I have 2. So I think The chapter's looking really good. There's obviously some parts near the end that need a little bit more time, but two high level topics that I think high-ish, let's call them mid-level topics that I think I didn't see addressed in here, and one of which we talked about a while ago. I don't see that in the topic in the notes either, is the idea of creating a Williston Land Trust or uh, a multi-town land trust. And I was thinking that could be a fourth strategy under the future conservation section objective. Um,
Yeah,
that could
like
be
Plattsburgh has one and Richmond has one. Yeah.
yeah, the goal of increasing visibility for donors and accelerating land conservation rates in Williston and the neighboring towns. I dropped that comment into the SharePoint document as well, but that was one thing. And then the other was around invasive species. I saw that topic down in the, what's it called? The idea list, but didn't see it reflected up in the plan itself yet. So I added a comment around that in, where to go? Under maintenance of, I thought I had under maintenance of conservation areas, but it's in there somewhere. Basically just to um, include management of invasive species in our conservation areas. And another comment I dropped in down in the notes section is, I don't know where or if this could go into the town plan, but um, the town maintenance operations, like for public works, for example, could adopt spread prevention measures for some of their machinery, like brush hogs and roadside mowers or whatever, to clean them to prevent the spread of seeds of invasive species from one section of road to the other, that kind of a thing.
Yeah, or in the case of Japanese knotweed, even plant
All right,
fragments. Yeah.
poison parsnip, yes, yep.
Is there any that now that you say that, Eric, I didn't remember seeing anything about ash trees or ash tree preservation in this. Is that gonna, we've talked about that in the past as wanting to have a more proactive approach to ash tree preservation against the invasive species.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's not in here in this chapter. I don't know that we would be able to do anything about preserving ash trees in like the larger chunks of land that are conserved, but out there
Well,
there I
yeah,
think there's another
that's what I was thinking of,
topic.
is that article in the that article that Terry was featured in, doing that actively at the Catamount Community Forest is was sort of illuminating, I guess, to me, that a little time, a little effort, and some money can keep some of those ancient trees
Yep.
healthy.
Yep.
We
Yeah.
do have, the town has an um an
EAB
emerald
plan.
ash borer response plan. I think everybody has heard me say this a million times. I wish that it was more focused on preserving trees that could be viable. That's like totally my bias. I treat the trees that are in my front yard. I think it's great that trees got treated at Catamount. And so um I think it would be cool to think about that. I think that like historically there has been like deep concern about trees' eventual infestation, decline, and the potential to fall on people and vehicles, especially ash trees that are in greenways, which is like super common just given the way that urban design happened at the time that it happened in Williston. So I think that like it could go in here, but I also think it might be like a bigger conversation that would involve folks outside of the Conservation Commission, and might be um trying to compromise or like move to the middle on positions that have historically, I think, been focused on removal, if that is fair. Anybody
Yeah.
can yeah, comment on
Um,
that if they feel like I got it
My,
wrong, but.
my, observation here is that there's a section in this chapter, maintenance of existing conservation areas and town-owned land. And there's an action item for forest management where appropriate to promote healthy forests. And I think that would be where something like what Kim is talking about and what we just saw at the Catamount Community Forest as a proactive management against invasive species that could be, I would like to see that added to the quiver of, what forest management,
Mhm.
looks like. So that would just be, I think, a small inclusion that is,
As
fairly.
that actually gets fleshed out. Could
Exactly.
be in there.
Right,
One
so that
potential
it's
spot.
forest management is more than just,
Logging or.
logging.
Yeah.
The other like related thing is that black ash is really culturally significant for Abenaki and the people that are part of Odanak Nation that say Wabanaki. And so it like kind of spans this forest management, cultural heritage preservation. It doesn't apply to green and white ash in the same way, but black ash is really important for basket weaving.
All right, thank you, Kim.
Did you get that note, Matt?
Note the spelling, of course, along the way. All right, so we're at 8:23. We obviously, I think, have started getting into this chapter. Does anyone feel strongly that we should get into the land use and subdivision design chapter, or should we hold that off for next time? And we have our next speaker here. I think we could move to Chase at this point, unless well, I just want to get a temperature check of people of where we're at.
I just wanted to make one comment about ash, talking about ash trees in particular, in that we could put a statement in forest management about treating or using biocontrol for tree species that under threat of disappearing, only because we're going to see other trees like hemlocks that we're also going to probably have to worry about. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah, I love that idea, and I love the idea of using broader language. Like, I really like that you said or biological control so that it's not restrictive, because there's so much work that's happening on this right now, and it's really, I think there's going to be like cool, innovative strategies that come out in like the next 10 years that we might not imagine right now. Like, I'm so excited about parasitizing wasps.
That has to go into the minutes for the record.
I was just thinking the
Yeah.
same thing.
Put it in there. Let the record show.
I mean, who wouldn't be excited about wasps?
And parasitic ones at that.
Yeah.
I think you pointed this out, Eric, but there is an action item that mentions land trusts, but it's more in like the outreach section. It's outreach to landowners. So I too would like to see something in here that says continue to look for opportunities to expand relationships with land trusts or explore creation of land trusts, so that we can hold easements on smaller parcels than what we can with the larger land trusts.
Yeah.
Maybe that goes in outreach to landowners, maybe that goes in more of the conservation through easements and acquisitions. So I don't think that's here, right? Yeah, we talk about URF, but we don't talk about maybe that's the section it goes in. Use URF, contribute to URF, and explore options for land trusts.
Yeah.
Creation of one or joining forces with other towns.
Yeah, I like the idea of exploring options, including, the formation of a land trust. I would want to explore that thoroughly as far as what our options are. The message I heard from Shelburne was that, their land trust may have actually not been a great formation for them.
Mhm.
And that they might have, it may have actually closed some doors and slowed the process down. So like, those are the types of things that we should, we would like to consider.
Mhm.
But not be prescriptive as, the Conservation Commission shall explore and open a land trust or something.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, I know I had a conversation with the town planner from 15 years ago, Lee Nellis, a guy who hired me here, and
I'm sure it was the same guy.
yeah, Lee and I were talking about the local land trust idea, and he said, Williston as a town is sophisticated enough, you guys ought to just be able to hold easements. And make it easy for people who want to convey off development rights and just do it in-house. And I think that's a valuable conversation to have too. And I noticed the mention of, municipalities as easement holders, and if you've got somebody who wants to conserve some land and you can make it easy for them to do it, that's the general principle.
Yeah.
Is, can you make it quick? Can you make it easy? Can you make it worth their while without a lot of entanglements? And I think what we're hearing from people is when they engage with Vermont Land Trust or somebody bigger, there's just a lot of strings attached, there's a lot of expense attached to it. And, it's one of those things where Williston can just say, hey, operationally, part of our operating budget is that we fund staffing to monitor easements. And, we won't charge people a big contribution to a stewardship bond to put their land under easement. So I think the plan calls for exploring all of that stuff under the general principle of make it as sort of seamless and easy as possible for people who want to conserve land in town to do so.
Great. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
I think we'll have to close that out. It's 8:30 and we'll move over to Chase. Thank you. And just as a reminder, I will have to leave at 8:45. So Kim, it looks like you're on at this point. And
I'm here. I will say that I joined and then I got like kicked off because the service was not as amazing as I thought it was going to be. So maybe there should be a backup.
All right. Well, I think let's start with Chase and see where we go, but I will have to leave at 8:45. And
Kim, I'm happy to be a backup if you're having connectivity issues. Since I'm in the room and won't have that issue.
Thanks. I'm at a pool.
Sounds nice.
Yeah.
Okay. Vermont Master Naturalist Mud Pond project idea.
I can.
Yeah, do you want to give a little introduction, Laura?
Yeah, I can introduce Chase. Chase is taking the Vermont Master Naturalist program called the Champlain Hills. Chase, do you live in Williston?
I actually live up in Essex Junction.
And I misrepresented her as a wetland ecologist, but her background is in aquatic ecology, but she's very interested in wetlands. And the Master Naturalist program requires a project that can be done independently, often in groups. And Chase is very interested in doing hers at Mud Pond. She really enjoys exploring wetlands there. And so I will let her tell you what she is thinking about doing. Thanks, Chase.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. Yeah, so I'm Chase. First, thank you so much for having me and for being so quick to share time in your agenda with me. It felt like quite the testament to how tight the local conservation community is that I sent an email to Alicia about a week ago, just saying, hey, I have this big idea for a project, and do you know anyone who I could talk to, might be connected to the Williston Conservation Commission or Mud Pond? And within a few days, Laura had reached out very graciously and spoken with Andrew and invited me here. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And it's been interesting to I've been in and out, but catching little bits of some of the work that you're doing. So really cool to be here. But yeah, as Laura mentioned, so I'm going through the Vermont Master Naturalist program the Champlain Hills chapter of the program, which is centered more up in the Underhill Cambridge area. So I'm a little bit on the edge of that. My background education is largely in freshwater ecology, and by day I'm an environmental analyst with Vermont DEC's drinking water and groundwater protection division. So I wear a few different hats, but largely manage the state's cyanotoxin monitoring program for public drinking water systems. And they do some geodatabase work on drinking water wells. But yeah, so as part of the Master Naturalist program, each participant is supposed to put at least 20 hours, volunteer hours, towards some kind of conservation project in the community, either independently or as part of a small team. So it could be anything from, natural resources inventory, monitoring wildlife corridors, leading public walks, anything like that. So I figured I can share some broad sketches of ideas for a project that would be focused on mud pond conservation area, and then I'd love to get your insight into whether you think it could fit with the goals of the Conservation Commission. And if so, it'd be great to just get some feedback on where and how to start narrowing the scope of the project from a team that kind of knows the management really well and has seen projects come through. So yeah, a bit of context. So I live in Essex Junction. I got to thinking about natural areas that I was already visiting and a bit invested in, and had been going on some walks in the mud pond conservation area and finding it to be just like a very beautiful, interesting mix of different natural communities and land features. And as Laura mentioned, I also, I find wetlands really fascinating and vital. And I had just been reading Bogs of the Northeast by Charles W. Johnson and came across the management plan for Mud Pond. Was really interested in this description of it being somewhere between a bog and a fen. So I was thinking maybe this could be an interesting location for a project. And then in considering broad topics, I've become especially interested in like transitions between upland and wetland ecosystems. So how soil qualities and plant communities change along these transitional landscapes. And I was on one walk in the area and got to noticing specifically where I was seeing a few different species of common ferns along the trails, which jumped out to me as a potentially interesting area of focus, because ferns are distributed throughout a lot of that conservation area, but the species composition really varies in different parts of it. And relatedly, ferns kind of span the range of wetland indicator statuses, which are used as a piece of wetland delineation. So some ferns are considered obligate wetland species, meaning they're almost always found in wetlands. Some are facultative, so about equally likely to be found in wetlands or uplands, and some are obligate upland species. And they're also more straightforward than some other plants to key out and identify common species of in the area, especially in the summer. So with those ideas and topics in mind, I've been thinking about a few possible project questions or objectives. I know Andrew shared an email correspondence where I talked a bit about some of this, but I'll just lay out a few broad directions that I'd been mulling over. So one is kind of just what species of fern are present in the mud pond conservation area, creating a basic inventory and description of local fern species. Two would be how are different fern species distributed in the conservation area, maybe with a particular focus on upland to wetland transitions. So I think that could go in a few different directions. It could involve looking at species compositions in quadrats along a few transects that kind of run up out of the kettle. Could also integrate some kind of spatial mapping of species distributions in a more specific confined section of the conservation area. And I think part of characterizing those distributions could involve grouping the species by their wetland indicator status to kind of visualize the relationship between the underlying hydrology and natural communities. And then that direction could also just be more of a descriptive than a quantitative project. So could just be broadly characterizing where different species appear and in some way analyzing how that relates to the topography and features of the area. And then last, yeah, go ahead.
I have a question because
Yeah.
you mentioned focusing around the Kettle area. So would you explore the east side of the road, or would you be thinking focusing only on that pond location?
Yeah, good question. Maybe more on the pond area. I think, I mean, but I would be open to thoughts about the
Yeah.
east side.
Well, I pointed out because there's such radically different uses on one side of the
Yeah,
park to the other, right? You've got quiet connector trail, walking path in, the west side of the park near the area of the pond. And then you've got a really active and vibrant mountain biking scene on the west side of the park. And you were mentioning that transition between the pond and the upland region. But there's also a radically different form of use in between those two sides and parcels.
yeah, that's a really interesting thought. That could be an interesting piece of it of looking at the different land uses and how we see those communities appear along that dichotomy, or not really a dichotomy, but yeah. And go ahead.
Yeah, dude, I really like that idea because we've made some assumptions. I think they're good assumptions, but we've made some assumptions about like what uses are appropriate where, and we had some conversations with the Quiet Connector about the fact that rather than having people go along the road, which is hazardous for them, but safer for wildlife and soils and stuff, that we would allow some more bike travel on the west side. So I think it would be interesting if in any way Chase, a project that you do, could give us any sort of insights or observations about the difference in use and whether you think the ferns are impacted or whether you think the ferns are impacting the ability of the land to tolerate different uses. I don't know if they would even be related, but I'm curious about it.
And I didn't mean to interrupt you on your presentation, Case. I just
No,
kind of jumped
that's
in.
no, that's great. This is exactly what I'm looking for, is sort of what questions are on your minds as you're thinking about future planning, and how can that inform how I frame this. So I really appreciate it. It's great. Um, and yeah, just continuing on that very briefly before I get to this. Well, actually, let me cover this last one, then we can talk
Yeah.
about all of it. So last one would be sort of how could you use education about ferns of the conservation area as a bit of a point of entry, or like a lens to invite visitors to notice diversity in conditions and land features and natural communities around them. So I was imagining one possibility being creating some kind of educational guide or self-guided walk to ferns in the conservation area that could point out certain spots along the trails to stop and look around with some interpretation. So there's, places where there are gaps in the canopy and soil disturbance from a tree fall or something where you see different species than even just across the trail. Some, related, call out some things with glacial landforms and features that might impact where you're seeing different communities. I think that could be an interesting spot also to bring in this question of how the land is currently being used, and how it could be in the future. But those types of kind of comparisons and examples. Yeah, so that's about what I've come up with so far. And I think with whatever form this project takes, I think the timeline would be roughly writing up a proposal in the next 2 or 3 weeks, doing any field work over this summer and early fall, and then doing more, work and write up and creating any maps or deliverables over the next few months, and then sharing that with the commission. Um, so yeah, I mean, I would love to hear a little bit more about what you might be interested in terms of what your thoughts are about future planning with specifically, especially the bike paths and what kind of information might be helpful for you to feed into that.
Go ahead. And then I see Eric.
Yeah.
I was just perusing the Mud Pond Conservation Area Management Plan, and I really liked your idea of a like a self-guided tour through the lens of the ferns that can be found in different areas. It would align well with one of our action items in the management plan, which is to encourage teachers and schools to use it as an outdoor classroom. So I think sometimes teachers have to come up with like, what's the point of doing a field trip there? I'm gonna have to come up with a curriculum. Maybe I have to go read the management plan, talk to the town about what we could do there. It would make it a lot easier if there was sort of like a default activity. And ferns are something that I think children would be pretty interested in. They're down at their level. They don't run away. You're guaranteed to see them pretty much, as opposed to like going on a birding walk and you're like, well, we might see stuff, we might not see stuff. It really depends on conditions. So I think it could be a really great entry point for the public, but also for the school system to consider using it.
That's great. Yeah, I think that could be a really interesting use, especially given that, right, there's so many pressures on teachers to have to be able to develop their own materials, and that can discourage certain activities or certain types of projects.
Especially if the signage and or like pamphlet guide to the tour, if there is a version or a way to make it kid friendly. So, if you go to like a botanical gardens, they'll have like two maps. They give you like your adult map and they have your kid map. And the kid map is all, color this in, look for things of these colors. Can you find these sculptures in the park? It's just written a little bit differently to engage them differently. And I think there's an opportunity to think about youth engagement with this topic.
All right, Eric.
Yeah, thanks, Chase. This is a great idea. And I think it's definitely it's pretty awesome that you're considering it for Mud Pond. I'm gonna take Reed's idea and build off of that a little bit, and I had some other thoughts too as you were talking. But so I think interpretation of the fern community in natural areas is I think could definitely be a really cool outcome, and I liked Reed's suggestion to maybe if you have the capacity to do one for adults and one for kids. I think another, and I don't recall what the scope of these master naturalist projects is, so maybe this is beyond the scope, but I think it would be interesting to set up an approach for other groups to do similar surveys. So like if you were able to like document your methods or whatever, to do similar surveys and assessments of the other natural areas in Williston, that maybe the schools, the higher grade levels in Williston Central School, for example, or CVU students maybe could take on, or some of our trail stewards could adopt to expand your work into our other natural areas that we have here in town. Other thoughts that I had would be, again, kind of back to documenting your methods, would be if the survey that you do could be repeatable over time, so we could repeatable in the future, so we could document changes over time in the fern community. I haven't taken I don't really know a lot about ferns beyond what a few things I remember from my botany class 25 years ago, so I don't recall if there are any kind of like indicator species or anything like that. That could be interesting too. I think that's all I had. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Eric.
Kim, are you connected enough to call on Laura?
Laura? Oh, you're muted right now.
Yes, I mean, do I have to say it? Laura, do you have your hand up?
No.
I can't even see hands up on my phone.
Thank you, Kim. So I also wanted to build off what Reed said, and not just teachers and schools to go with an educational pamphlet or something that you make on the computer. But adults, Mud Pond, I think, is one of our least used natural areas. And also adults, I think, would be really interested in going and saying, especially if you're tying the geology in with the ferns and what's there, wetlands versus like the whatever, if you're looking at the cames also. I just think that adults love that stuff. That's all I wanted to say. Thanks.
Yeah, so true. Yeah, I think it'd be great to try to connect all of those in some ways, and I think wouldn't be too much of a stretch to do through some kind of more descriptive analysis. I did have one question for you all, which is, if for whatever form this does take, would it be acceptable for me to go off trail to do some sampling? And what might be some, guidelines around that?
Kim, I feel like you're somebody who would have
Well, I was
good
gonna say,
practices.
I'm wondering do we have, my answer is yes, it would be acceptable, but I'm like a professional researcher, so I'm like all things in the name of science. And I'm wondering also if we have, are there restrictions outlined in the management plan for the conservation area? And if the answer is no, I think that the next step in either, like, regardless, would be for Chase to put together a proposal and to have that include methods and like any negative impacts or unforeseen consequences of those methods, so that we could just evaluate and weigh, kind of standard, this is what I want to do, here's what I envision the impacts of that to be, good, bad, and ugly.
Mm-hmm.
And then we would just evaluate it as a commission. And my guess is that we would, unless it was like, I'm going to trample all the ferns through my sampling and they'll be decimated, that probably, or you know what I mean? Barring
Yeah.
some horrible unforeseen impacts, I don't see why doing plots off the trail. It seems like you would need to, right?
I think for at least most of these ideas, other than having a project that was sort of focused on, as you walk along the trail, what are you seeing? I think beyond that, doing
Yeah.
some kind of sampling off trail would be key.
So that would be I think the next step, regardless, would be a proposal that outlines targets, methods, consequences of methods, benefits, etc. And then we could respond to that. What do other people think?
I agree. I also think it's important that when people who are walking on the trail, if they see Chase off the trail, she can also let them know that she has permission, because she's doing, she's doing a project.
Yeah, thanking them for staying on the trail and explaining why you're off the trail would be a valuable connection point. I agree, Kim, about talking through a proposal about the sites that you'd be visiting, Chase, and how much you'd be going off trail or what you'd be doing for sampling would be helpful. I don't have any concerns at this point. And I just took a peruse through the management plan to see if it says anything about that, and it doesn't. It just says that the primary mode in that side on the west side is pedestrian traffic on the primitive trail. But we have done walking tours there before, where we've stepped off trail to look at things as it relates to visits to update the management plan or assess impacts to things. So I think it would be consistent with past use that if you're doing research, that it's okay, as long as we know what you're doing and it's communicated to people who might run into you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And obviously, if we're going to be developing materials to invite people there, we'll want to find ways to keep folks on trail. And the pamphlet probably should also emphasize the importance or the educational signage should probably emphasize the importance that it's really interesting to go look at the ferns, but we have to remember to stay on trail because we can also harm them.
I think that's a great idea to include some messaging about that in whatever kind of materials come out of it. And could you tell me just briefly in the last couple minutes here a little bit more about what you're interested in looking at with those two areas of the management area, with the more pedestrian focused and the more bike focused sections?
Yeah, David had to step out. Does anybody have specific thoughts about what would be interesting to look at on the east versus the west side of the road? I can share.
Which I'm trying to visualize east versus west side of which road?
The east is the biking side, and the west is the Mud Pond Conservation Area side.
Oh, okay.
Of South Road.
South Road.
South.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's the road. That's
Sorry, not
which
east
road are we
west of the
talking about?
pond, east and west of the road. Yeah,
All right.
Country Park versus Conservation Area.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I guess Chase, if you're interested in the ferns that are in the more wetland habitat type area, then I guess, focusing on the west side of the road makes sense to me around the pond. Um, the upland area of the biking trails and all that could be interesting, but I guess from my perspective, I'd be curious to see what's in the wetland area.
I'm gonna second that and just also add that my main reason for like not being super interested in the comparison is that there's a lot of recreation ecology papers that try to look at sort of like difference between high traffic areas and low traffic areas around sort of like different activities. And they tend to be so idiosyncratic that they're not broadly useful, right? So it will be like the impact of horseback riding on clay trails in this corner of this place, and then like the soils and composition and et cetera are so specific to that place that it would really only help that location make a management decision. And I can't honestly foresee a time when we would say, well, we're not going to have mountain biking at Mud Pond anymore because like the bike and foot traffic has like a reduced impact on the species. So unless somebody is like, oh, actually, I know something really specific about the species and I think that work would be broadly applicable, I'm like less inclined towards like tiny idiosyncratic recreation ecology work because I don't know. I don't see it get used very often. I don't know if someone can argue with me, but that's my position.
I agree with Kim. And plus, Chase, you have limited hours. This is, and it's supposed to be a fun project, something you're interested in. You're interested in wetlands.
Yeah, I was gonna say, oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say that I'm interested in the two sides, but the only question I can think of that I'm really interested in is just, and it wouldn't require going very far onto the other side, is just even qualitative observations. Just simply, if you were to visit the other side, this is what an educated eye sees in terms of the changes in species, and it could be a paragraph that could be adopted into our management plan too, if we have a description of the natural areas. So on the country park side, we could include something that mentions that extensive work has been done to study the fern communities on the other side, and the differences on the country park side are XYZ. But I think it would just be a nice to have. I think I second Laura's opinion that whatever you're really passionate about is going to produce the best work. So, follow your interest.
Okay, great. That sounds good. Yeah, I think a couple of thoughts. One, I think Kim, that's a really good point. I think besides just being like, okay, there's some amount of scope question here of 20 or 30 hours. to focus in on one or two questions. With it being so localized, I think I would also be very reluctant to draw any conclusions about impacts specifically, about to be able to say anything about what those differences in communities, if those have anything to do with the recreation patterns. That being said, I think certainly just walking through the other side, I think that would be a pretty quick side project to do, is just walking through the other side of it, noting what kinds of species are there, maybe characterizing the natural communities on that side, and having that as a footnote or as a paragraph that could go into the management plan feels very feasible. And then I would say on the west side, there, even with it being largely that wetland area, there also are some interesting transitions even just on that side going into the uplands of that side. So see some variation there too. Yeah.
I think that sounds super cool. Reed, I'm gonna pass it to you because I gotta pull this tiny swimmer out of swim practice. Thank you for carrying the torch. Thanks for coming, Chase.
Thank you so much for having me.
No worries. We're basically at time. Is that an okay place to pause with you, Chase? Do you
I
feel
think
like you
that's
have
great.
enough to go on?
Yeah, I think I'll start writing something up, and maybe should I pass that through Laura to bring to the commission? Does that make sense?
Yeah, Laura, and if she copied Andrew,
Okay.
our staff assignee, then you're welcome to communicate with him directly. But I'm sure Laura will be happy to get your note to him. We would love to have you back to have a brief conversation about your proposal when it's ready.
Great.
And sounds like there's no red flags at this point from the commission. Thank you for your interest in Williston and Mud Pond.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We are a little late on other business and upcoming meetings, but we can see if there's anything that you wanted to call out, Matt. Were there any notes from Andrew?
No, just noting from this meeting, we'll push off and bring back the rural land use subdivision design town plan chapter for August 7th, and then
And also the Catamount Community Forest appointee.
Yep. Other than that, you do have a habitat disturbance assessment for a subdivision on Nob Hill Road coming to you next time, so stay tuned for that. We talked about whether we would try to do that today or not, and it felt like a full agenda, and I want, since Andrew's staffing that subdivision, I wanted him to have that, and not me for August 7th, so you'll be doing a little development review next time too.
The only other thing I can think of is we were talking about the ERF funding aspect there, and I was mentioning that I had one interaction with a select board member where there was interest in knowing whether we were going to bring forward a proposal like a penny for conservation. And what I got from that conversation is that if we're interested in bringing something like that forward, and we want it to have any bearing on this year's budget discussions, it would need to come soon.
Yeah.
So just something to maybe put in the notes for Andrew that we could consider continuing discussion on that particular issue next time or at the following meeting. But budget conversations will pick up, I think, in late August. Is the next meeting of the select board. They're taking the first meeting off.
Yep.
And by the time we get to late August, early September, you're already into the budget conversation. So
yeah.
There was a sense of urgency from that conversation about, well, don't wait too long, because if you want to do something this year, we're gonna run out of time.
Yeah.
That's that. Any final comments? Right, then I'll declare us adjourned. Thank you, everybody.
Great. Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Enjoy the
Have a
kid
good
there.
day. Thanks.
Bye.
Where have they put end meeting now? And here we go.
There we go, in the bottom corner.